Hello and welcome to another Album of Record podcast. I'm Craig, joined as always by Andrew. This is take two with lots and lots of technical difficulties, but we're going to roll with it. So, how's it going, Andrew?
Good. It's just like a little bit of deja vu here, but I'm still doing well. I am very tired. When it comes to the podcast comes first, nap comes second.
Yeah. All right, so today we are talking about one album. Specifically, we're talking about The Bends by Radiohead. This is a fun one because we'll get into, when you first came across The Bends by Radiohead and when I first came across it, but this album didn't always have to be the jumping off point, the wild success that it became. It was a band that was really struggling to follow up their debut record, and specifically a worldwide phenomenon song like Creep. This band absolutely could have become a one-hit wonder, lost to history forever and ever and ever. They struggled to follow up that record. After the fact, we found out they struggled in the studio. We found out that the record company was looking over their shoulder, hoping for at least one creep, if not multiple creeps on the Bends. They made a record that completely defied the conventions of Creep, went their own way, and somehow it all kind of worked out.
Yeah. We should maybe we should start by mentioning why we're talking about this album.
But yeah.
This album came out March 13th, 1995. Which means we are coming up on the 30-year anniversary of this album, which is really pretty amazing that this has been around for 30 years. And I think we've talked about this in the past that, sometimes, as we get older, like you just lose perspective on the time of some of these things. And like 30 years just seems insane for some of these albums that we're going to talk about this year. This is certainly one of them. And I think it is worth talking a little bit about what Radiohead was before this. So, you touched on it a little bit. They put out Pablo Honey. What was that? Maybe 93 that Pablo Honey came out?
I think so.
And, it did fairly well. Creep was a massive hit, both in the UK and in the US. And I think there was a little bit of a sense that Radiohead might be a one-hit wonder band. I think there was some talk in the UK music press about that at the time. And so going into the studio, they really had like all this pressure from the studio to give them another Creep, produce another Creep. And what's interesting is they worked with the producer John Leckie. He had worked with Magazine, the Stone Roses. I think he had even worked with Pink Floyd a little bit. And they kind of both agreed a little bit that they weren't going to do that there was no internal pressure on to do another Creep. If anything, they wanted to do the opposite. The band had already at that point sort of disowned that song. And when they handed the Bends over to the record label, and the record label, sent out some test copies to people to get reactions. The immediate reaction was, well, there's no Creep on here. Nothing. This doesn't sound like Creep. Where is that? And what the record label did, which was kind of interesting, is they did intentionally put Fake Plastic Trees as the first single, as a way to say, look, this is not going to be an album that has another Creep on it. This is an entirely different direction from the band. And I think that kind of set the table for how a lot of people perceived it, and maybe some of the initial lackluster reception that this album got, because something we're going to talk about in a minute is the way people think about this album has actually changed quite a bit in the wake of what came after it, and in particular, OK Computer, the follow-up. But, at the time, this album wasn't poorly received. I mean, it was received generally pretty well, but I don't think it was thought of as like, oh my gosh, Radiohead is about to become the biggest rock band in the world.
No, I think that's true. But also, I think, there's some additional context in terms of how this record was unleashed on the world because My Iron Lung came out in 94, as like, hey, here's a teaser from the band that brought you Creep. And My Iron Lung didn't exactly hit people in a way where they were going, all right, well, here comes the next great record from this band. And then they did, so I had to look, and then they released High and Dry and Planet Telex on a
Well,
double.
that's
And
after.
then,
That was
and then
after.
Fake, go ahead.
Now that order's not right. Fake Plastic Trees was the first single from it.
That's not what Wikipedia says. It says My Iron Lung came out in September of 94, and that sounds familiar because there was like almost like an EP from the band in 94, and then High and Dry and Planet Telex says it was released in February of 95. But this one gets confusing to me, was that because there were also, back in those days, there were different release dates for Europe/Britain and the United States as well.
Well,
So I'm
that's what I
not
was going to
totally
say.
positive.
Like Just was only a UK single, but the video got airplay in the US. But it was technically only a UK single. And My Iron Lung was actually a later single that was released to Ireland. That was, so I don't know, like maybe some of these dates are differing depending on UK versus US. Maybe that could be part of it. But yeah, like High and Dry was an outtake from Pablo Honey, actually. I do know
Okay.
that.
So here we go. This explains it. And it also explains my confusion. It was the third single from the Bends in the UK and the first in the US.
Okay.
But I had found a copy of the High and Dry Planet Telex import EP
yeah,
in a record store. And so I had that one early. And I think I had My Iron Lung imported as well, because I was one of those psychos who went to the record store and paid extra money for imports.
Yeah, for sure.
But I can't for the life of me go back in time and figure out. I liked Creep, but I was largely disappointed by the whole of Pablo Honey. And I can't for the life of me figure out why I was buying all that Radiohead stuff. Like, I don't know what led me to be that excited about it before I would have known that the Benz was going to be good. But I was in.
Because none of those singles, I don't think any of those singles even, I think Fake Plastic Trees charted like in the US, but not very high. And none of those singles really did well in the UK or the US initially. And it was only when Street Spirit was finally released that, like, Street Spirit was the one that really made people sit up and really start to pay attention to this. That was the breakthrough single.
Well, I certainly remember the Fake Plastic Trees music video.
Yes.
I'm not sure that Radiohead or the Bends become what they become without the music video for Fake Plastic Trees, because the song, you can say what you want about the song. I think it's a classic, but with its tempo and everything else, without that video, I'm not sure it hits the way it does in the United States without that video.
Yeah, like all the videos for this, the combined videos between the Bends and OK Computer are all just incredible. They were at such a creative peak for music video. Like the Just music video is still to this day one of my top 2 or 3 favorite all-time music videos. And then yes, the Fake Plastic Trees video is also incredible. Like they were getting play on like 120 minutes, and you know, if you were in the music scene, you were aware of Radiohead and what they were doing. But none of this was like, it's just hard to like remember, but like none of this was perceived in a way of like, hey, Radiohead is going to be this incredibly huge and culturally important band. It was just, hey, like, you know, these are interesting songs. Like, I do think to some degree, like this is all, again, you touched on this right from the intro. There was a lot of inner turmoil with the band, and I think they just didn't necessarily know what direction they wanted to go, what kind of band they wanted to be, because when this album came out, I do know that the reaction of the UK press was, well, you know, Pablo Honey was kind of a post-grunge album that made people think maybe this was going to be the third member of the Britpop wave with Oasis and Blur. And when this album came out, there was a sense that, like, okay, this is darker, more layered and complex guitar parts. Like, okay, so maybe they're not really going to be on the level of Oasis and Blur in the UK. And a lot of that reaction changed first with certainly with Street Spirit. Like when Street Spirit was released as a single, and the video is phenomenal as well. That sort of, I think, made people sit up and say, okay, there is a little something different here. Like this band is doing something. And it was really after OK Computer came out, and then maybe even Kid A after that, that like retroactively, I think a lot of people got more excited about the Bends. And, you know, at the time, Rolling Stone wasn't talking about them, you know, but like later on down the road, Rolling Stone, Pitchfork, NME, like all these big music publications all have the Bends ranked in their greatest albums, rock albums of all time list. So it's just kind of interesting to think about the way this album was received versus how it's perceived today. Because it's like easy to talk about all these songs. Like we've mentioned all these incredible songs that everybody knows, you know, Planet Telex, The Bends, High and Dry, Fake Plastic Trees, Just, My Iron Lung, Street Spirit. Like these are all hugely important songs today. But I think the reason even our own recollection of the timeline is so jumbled is because at the time, I don't think this was really just talked about that much as like a really important album. I think a lot of that came later.
Yeah, I think so too. I think it was this album's reputation was almost cast after the fact. If I'm remembering it correctly, I think we looked at this album like, wow, I didn't see that coming. But not like the over-the-top praise that we have today. But I think it's also worth noting, I found a really great article from Louder, how Radiohead made the Bends their first masterpiece. And like stuff, it just puts you in the mindset of the band who's trying to follow up Creep, who's trying to figure out what's next. The label demanded more hit singles and even asked the band to record all the, quote, potential singles before the rest of the album. Yeah. So like they wanted the band to prove it in the studio with something that sounded like hits. Like what does that even mean? But that's what they wanted. The early recording sessions were fraught with self-doubt and stress. Tom York later admitted that he sat in the studio thinking, I don't think we can pull this together. We're just going to have to split up. At one point he fantasized about driving away and never coming back. Well, Ed O'Brien agreed. It was horrible. We were questioning everything, thinking too much. The pressure cooker environment led their manager to nearly quit. Then the part about the label interference. Apparently, John Leckie was the ultimate buffer between the band and the label.
Yes.
He fielded the concerned but polite phone calls from EMI executives who were anxious about the slow progress.
Yeah, I think he was I really do like. So Nigel Godrich was the engineer on this album, and he would go on to become their primary producer for the rest of their career. But I think in that moment that John Leckie was sort of like the perfect producer that they needed to get through this phase, you know, to really become, because like OK Computer, you could hear the confidence in a way that you don't hear in the Bends. Like it's easy to read these stories and then retroactively apply it to it, but you really can hear in these songs a lot of that self-doubt and indecision, both in the lyrics and in the music itself. And the band was even still figuring out what they were as a band. Like if you go back to Pablo Honey, like Johnny Greenwood's guitar playing is not noticeable. And like the way it would become later. Like I feel like the Bends was sort of their first time of really letting, you know, particularly Johnny and, you know, Ed O'Brien as well a little bit, but, you know, primarily Johnny, really explore some of these textures and layering different sounds. And they were using a lot more pedals and effects on the Bends compared to Pablo Honey. Pablo Honey has a very static sound throughout most of the album, whereas the
Yeah, it
Bends
was
is,
like clean guitars and distortion, clean
yes,
guitars and distortion.
yeah. And you get a lot more lush sounds all over the spectrum on the Bends. And, what's funny is as OK Computer sort of began their journey into the electronic side of music as well, I think you could almost argue that maybe the Bends is their best guitar album, which is interesting because I don't know actually where like the songwriting falls today within Radiohead, like how much is Johnny versus Tom. But at this time, I'm pretty sure it was primarily Tom doing most of the writing of the music. And I think that, what you sort of get is, again, this balance of figuring out like what are we even as a band. And I think them leaning into being a lot more creative with the guitar, both in sounds and textures and just the types of guitar parts that they were writing, would sort of inform what they did after. So even though we retroactively look back at the Bends and sort of change that perception, the Bends was still an extraordinarily necessary step in order for them to get to where they were going after this.
Right. Well, and if they had just met Nigel Godrich and tried to start producing with him, they never would have had the buffer that they needed, or the kind of credibility that Leckie brought to the process. And to your point about the guitars, that was something else I read while I was doing my homework on the Bends. It's like you listen to this album for 30 years and you feel like you know it, but then you read 7 articles with interviews from the band about how they made it and all the inner workings of different things. And Leckie had a lot to do with the experimentation on the guitar sounds. It said they used all kinds of different guitars, amps, and different tunings, pedals, the Digitech whammy pedal, and different amps, and all kinds of different things. And it probably, that is probably a jumping off point for the band as well in terms of the experimentation. And obviously, they took it to a whole new level at future points in their career. But who knows if they get there without having somebody kind of show them the way on how to tinker in the studio and use the studio as an actual instrument, because that's
Yeah.
the other thing that you can say for sure is that production becomes an instrument on the Bends in ways that it never did in Pablo Honey.
That's a really great point. Like I think too, when we did our deep dive on Super Unknown, even though Super Unknown wasn't an early career album for Soundgarden, it was actually a later career. But we talked a lot about Michael Beinhorn, and when he wasn't necessarily Soundgarden's preferred or ideal producer or whatever, but he did teach them to use the studio as an instrument. And I think you made a great point there. I think Leckie did sort of the same thing. He was sort of a transition producer for them. He wasn't going to be the guy who's going to produce them the rest of their career. But I do really feel like it makes sense that you have this guy that, again, I don't know what he all did with Pink Floyd, but I know he did do some work with Pink Floyd in the past. And if you want a lesson in guitar to create soundscapes, like, look no further than David Gilmour, right? And,
Yeah.
so I think some of that probably carried through a little bit to this in terms of just being sort of instructional in, hey, like, you guys don't just have to do that post grunge thing that you were doing, the clean and distorted sound. Like we can color outside the box and create a lot of different sounds. So how much that was purely him, I don't know, but I think you make a good point that he did sort of get them over that initial hurdle. He gave them the buffer that allowed it to make sure that the pressure from the studio didn't crush the band internally. And from things I've read, it sounds like he was not a guy who was pressuring them to write Creep. Like he was giving them space to do what they wanted to do.
All right, let's talk about a couple songs, because the tidbits from that article lend credence to your point and are just absolutely hysterical.
Okay.
So, did you read anything about Planet Telex and how Tom York was lying on the studio floor drunk and improvising lyrics, and that's what made the final cut?
Okay.
So John Leckie apparently allowed that.
Yep.
So Nice Dream. All 5 band members strummed acoustic guitars outside on the lawn of the studio, listening to each other on headphones in a cosmic kumbaya circle.
Interesting. Does it say
And
which studio that was? Because they recorded it.
RAK, Rack.
Okay. So RAK was the first studio, I'm pretty sure, that they did for the first sessions. And then they did Abbey Road after that. And then they did some in the Manor Studios, which I don't know what that is.
Yeah, and then some of the strings and the atmospherics were recorded at Abbey Road as well. But by the way, I'm just like stealing tidbits from this article, how Radiohead made the bends their first masterpiece louder. So go find that article. It's really good. Tom York struggled to nail the vocals for Fake Plastic Trees until he attended a Jeff Buckley concert. Moved to tears by Buckley's performance, Tom returned to the studio and recorded his vocal in just 3 takes.
So I have heard that story, and I do know a little bit of
I'd
background.
forgotten that one.
A little bit of background about that is, if anything was originally going to be an attempt to be Creep, it was Fake Plastic Trees. And they had a version of that song in the studio that was heavily overproduced, like throwing everything into this like big song.
I think Greenwood compared it to November Rain.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then after that, though, is when, after Tom saw that performance, came back, they stripped it down, did it acoustic. Tom nailed the vocals, and they were like, nope, that's the song. And I don't know if
And it still gets big and swells toward the end,
yeah,
but it
absolutely
doesn't get unwieldy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd be curious to know, like, I'm not somebody who's really, I know there are Radiohead fans out there who like really dive into all the demos and outtakes and things that are out there, and there is a lot of material out there if you're a mega Radiohead fan. I'd be curious to know if any takes of that original version are out there of Fake Plastic Trees. I'd be curious to know what that sounds like.
I would love to hear it.
Yeah,
I would love to hear that. All right, you ready for more?
Yeah, absolutely. Hit me.
All right. So the backing track for My Iron Lung is actually a live recording from a show they played in Astoria, London's Astoria, in May of 1994. They were having trouble capturing the energy and the ferocity of that song, and they ended up using the actual guitars and bass from that live recording.
That's actually incredible.
Yeah, let's see. Live guitars and drums, and Tom overdubbed his vocals later in the studio.
Wow.
All right, High and Dry. Actually, that one came from the Pablo Honey days, and this one just reminds me of Better Man, because Tom York thought it was a crap song.
Yeah, that's a great comparison, actually.
So High and Dry.
It's not my. It's
you should talk about High and Dry.
It is not my favorite song on this album, and it is a very popular song. You know, I know it was used, like, one of my favorite TV shows is The Newsroom, which I watch and rewatch all the time. They did use High and Dry in that, and it's actually really powerful the way they used it. And in that context, it sort of works, which has sort of changed how I feel about the song a little bit. But like, as a song, like, it is like, I did not know that it was from the Pablo Honey sessions until doing some research for this episode. But as soon as I heard that, I was like, oh, that makes total sense. That's totally a Pablo Honey song, and that's why I'm not as crazy about it as I am a lot of the other songs on this album.
Well, and much like Better Man, I didn't appreciate it when it first came out, but over time, although Better Man I've grown to appreciate because of the live versions and the sing-alongs and in person, I've grown to appreciate High and Dry as I'm removed from how much it was played on radio, because it truly was one of the most accessible, easy to play for a DJ type hits. And so it was all over alternative rock radio for a long time. And I think it even leaked over to adult contemporary a little bit because of those lush vocals. It was very easy.
I am curious, like, you know, not to derail us into a Better Man discussion, you know, talking about like gaining appreciation for it live. I had actually heard the song on bootlegs because they had played it live before they ever released the song. And I remember hearing it live and really loving it and thinking it was exciting. And I remember when I got Vitology, listening to it and being like, this isn't as good. Like I just very strongly remember that feeling the first time hearing Better Man on Vitology and not thinking that the live version lived up to that the studio version did not live up at all to the live version that I had heard previously.
Yeah. So the next place you talked about kind of the reception, and how it was taken in Britain versus how it was accepted or not accepted in the U.S. The reviews were really mixed. I have some samples. The Rolling Stone 1995 review complimented Tom York's voice, but complained that his lyrics eroded the power of the songs. The Chicago Tribune skeptically wrote that the Bends offered little to suggest there'll be more than one-hit wonders.
Yeah.
And Spin Magazine said that the record had too much nodded out nonsense mumble and not enough concrete emotion.
And that's so funny that like thinking about people, imagine people saying that about Tom York today. Like it's unthinkable that anybody would make those comments about him today.
Were you able as a kid when we got this record to understand all the lyrics, and did you really take them in?
No.
I had to read the lyrics of all of Radiohead to really get most of them.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And this maybe can lead us a little bit into something you had alluded to, was talking about how we originally received this album. I think you talked about, you had heard all these singles. I actually don't believe, to my memory, that I either had heard or at least certainly just wasn't paying attention to them until Street Spirit came out. And yeah, like that is a song that I could not understand at all what Tom was saying, but I somehow didn't care. It didn't matter to me what Tom was saying because the lyrics were, the vocal melody was just so haunting on that song and so beautiful that like it didn't matter what he was saying. You felt what he was trying to get across without understanding the lyrics in that song. Like it literally could not matter less what he's actually saying in that
But it's
song.
really funny that you mentioned that, because it's like, all right, I got the first line, row of thousands bearing down on me. I can't touching me. It's like a blank,
Yeah,
blank, blank, and you catch like
you
two
just get the
words here and
words.
there.
Yeah, yeah, yep. So no, and it was only after that then that but like I do remember seeing some people talking about the Bends before that, but I just wasn't paying attention. It just wasn't something that I was really like paying. I hadn't gone out and gotten the album. It was only when I heard Street Spirit that like I don't remember anymore if I got it from Columbia House or if I went down to the record store to get it, but somehow one way or the other, like that was the song that made me get it. And then like going back and hearing these songs, and then when a Radiohead video would come on 120 minutes, I'd pay attention. But for me, it really didn't hit me until after Street Spirit.
Yeah, I can't tell you exactly when or where. I had heard those early release singles, but then I think I I just remember being cemented by the video for Fake Plastic Trees. And so those were the days where I sometimes bought stuff and maybe listened to it once, and then it sat on the shelf until inspiration struck. So I could have bought it the week that it came out or 2 weeks after it came out and then not really listened to it for 6 months. That was a little bit more commonplace back in the old days. I remember a friend of mine told me to buy the Parentheses album by Sigur Rós, and
Mm-hmm.
this is in the 2000s. We're no longer in the 90s. This is the 2000s. But that album sat on my shelf for like 18 months, and I'd only listened to it once. And
Yeah.
then I fell in love with it like 2 years later. But that was a phenomenon of buying too much and owning it and having it sit there until it finally hit you, if you ever gave it another chance.
So I have a funny story about that. I was the type of person that would compulsively buy anything that I remotely thought I might like. If I heard one song that was good, I'd go out and buy the CD. And to your point, I had so many CDs that I would listen to once and then it would just sit there and I wouldn't listen to it again. And there was this, I grew up not about a half hour away from Bowling Green, and I would
Bowling Green, the college in Ohio, not the
that is
city in
correct.
Kentucky.
That is correct. Yep, the university. And they had this really great, tiny little independent CD store called Mad Hatter. Well, they actually had two. They also had Finders, which was much larger and was actually an awesome record store that just got sold a year or two ago, which was kind of bittersweet, but that's probably not interesting to anybody else who has never been to Finders. But Mad Hatter was just this like really small little place, but they had the glass case up front with bootlegs of all these different bands. So I would take, like, on weekends, me and my buddy, we would go up to Bowling Green, and I would take a stack of those CDs that I hadn't listened to more than a couple times, and I would trade them in so I could get like a Pearl Jam bootleg or something. And inevitably, like, there would always be these things, like, later the band would maybe blow up or I'd hear more of it and I'd be like, I really shouldn't have sold that. I really wish and then I'd have to go out and buy it again.
Not to mention, when you're trading in those discs, you were just setting money on fire.
Well, yeah, I
You
mean,
paid
absolutely.
$13 to $15 for them and getting 3 if you're
Correct.
lucky.
It was usually about $3 per disc. Yep. But that was how I lived
And then
my life.
you could go
that was
buy
the
it back in
experience.
the used section for $5.
Yeah, like trying to find my copy. Like, which one of these was mine? I should have started like marking the liner notes or something with a little mark so I can find my copy.
So that's not too bad. So you bought it for 15, you sold it back for 3, so that's 12. You bought it back for 5, that's 17. You got $17 in it.
Yeah. And I got a bootleg. I had so many.
And by the way, bootleg, they used to call them imports.
Yeah.
So that they could get away with just selling bootlegs. But
Right.
they were just bootlegs.
They were just bootlegs. Yep.
And they would charge $30 for a single and $59.99 for a double CD.
Yeah, they were very expensive, and like it was a huge industry into itself. Like, you know, if you remember, there were quote unquote bootleg labels, like actual, like, they fashioned themselves as record labels, and they would put out like just mass produce these bootlegs. They'd give them a title, and they would have like a cover for it and like liner notes, and it was like professionally printed.
The Pearl Jam ones are legendary. I'm sure there were other bands that had legendary ones, but
yeah,
you know,
there was Pearl Jam had Chapters was a big one. Vortical was a big one. Piss Bottle Men was a big one, and then Hallucinogenic Recipe, the bootleg box set, which I actually still have. That's
I always
one
felt
that
good
I
because
kept.
I had one called Costa Rica, which is really rare.
Yeah.
But anyway, back to Radiohead. So did it surprise you at all when, I know it's 30 years and everything else, but looking at the date, I just turned 46, which means that I had just turned 16 when this record came out. But in my mind, I was like 14 or 15 when this one came out. So it was like very hard for me to even recognize the fact that my memory was so faulty about how old I was when this came out at all.
I think I remember driving around with this album in my car, so I think that helps me maybe maintain a little bit of a proper age for it. But again, like, I was coming to this fairly late. Like, in my mind, the Bends and OK Computer were like back to back.
Oh, wow.
Because I was very late to the Bends. I just was not, you know, I definitely remember
that would never work for me because the Bends is clearly high school. And for me, OK Computer was clearly college. And so anytime I've got that high school to college separation between records, like, I know for a fact Rage Against the Machine was all high school until the Battle of Los Angeles. But Evil Empire and actually Rage Against the Machine was middle school, I guess. But I just know pre-college and post-college and in college.
That first Rage Against the Machine album still, like, in my head, feels like a 1994 album to me. Like, it
was in 92.
Yeah. And I think I was honestly probably late to that one too. That's probably why I remember it that way. Because I have the same thing in my head with Rage Against the Machine. It feels like their first album, the self-titled album, and then Evil Empire feel like they were like back to back. Like they just came out one right after the other. Deftones is like that for me too. Adrenaline and Around the Fur feel like they're back to back because I was late to Adrenaline as well. So
And meanwhile, those are my examples of bands where I couldn't believe how long it was in between their first and their second record. Tool being the other one between, not their
a
first and second,
Tool,
because it was Undertow to Anima.
that one I felt.
But Evil Empire to Rage Against the Machine was almost exactly the same.
Well, I know, but I was
Yeah,
in on Undertow early, so that's the
sure.
difference.
Yeah. So anyway,
Like, were you like, I think you touched on it a little bit, like being
yeah,
disappointed in Pablo Honey, but like, were you like, did you like actively listen to Pablo Honey? Like, were you like in on Radiohead at that point, or do you even remember what your perception of them was before the Bends even came out?
I do, because I was over at a friend's house. I used to sleep over at friends' houses before I was old enough to drive, and we would always watch Saturday Night Live, and then we watch MTV 120 minutes because
Yeah,
bedtime, it was like the first time in our lives where bedtimes didn't mean anything. And I
yeah,
remember sitting in his house in Chesterland, Ohio, when Creep came on, and I saw Creep on, I think it was 120 minutes for the first time, and watching that video and just the strobe lights of the explosion of the guitars and the peak of Tom York's voice when he's hitting those high falsettos, and the song is just exploding until it finally resolves into this little plinky finish. I had to have that album, and I didn't like the rest of the record, but I still didn't regret it because I loved Creep that much.
yeah.
Um,
You know where I first heard Creep? Beavis and Butthead.
oh my God.
I was at a friend's house. We were watching Beavis and Butthead, and it came on. And I just remember thinking like how incredible it was. But it's such a funny concept to like see it while Beavis and Butthead are making fun of it, of course.
Well, and to your point, the first time I ever saw Beavis and Butthead, I was with that same exact friend
Yeah,
whose house I had slept over. Yeah,
yeah,
that just the visceral time period of Beavis and Butthead, 120 minutes. MTV is such a phenomenon that you have trouble explaining to anybody. And I know I've
yeah,
talked about it on this podcast before, but then to watch Radiohead and Tom York in particular looking like a vamping goth kid in the sun of the MTV Beach House poolside performing Creep is
yeah.
just one of the most hysterical video clips. I beg of you to go look at it on YouTube. It's hysterical.
Yeah, I think a lot of people maybe don't even like everybody knows Beavis and Butthead, and I don't know how much everybody actively watched it, but as somebody who did watch a lot of Beavis and Butthead, like I would literally go to my friend's house all the time because I didn't have cable. So I'd go over to his house to watch Beavis and Butthead, and we would just like binge watch it. It would be on like all afternoon. And I saw so many music videos. Like people don't realize how many cutting edge artists Beavis and Butthead was exposing us to. And even though it was through a concept of them making fun of a lot of it, it was like, I mean, there were things that were terrible that you could tell they were like leaning into it, but like a lot of it was a very like tongue in cheek way of exposing people to this cutting edge music that you wouldn't see if you were just watching like regular daytime MTV music video programming. Like if you remember, like during the like early parts of the mornings and like early afternoons would be like all the like most popular music videos of the time. And then in the like evenings or late afternoon is you'd get your Beavis and Butthead type things. And then like you said, Saturday nights was 120 minutes. There was Headbangers Ball at one point. Like all these shows. And it is like Radiohead just could not be more of a fish out of water in that setting. Like of all those bands that we talk about, like Radiohead, like they've never looked like rock stars. They've never behaved like rock stars really. It was just always this surreal thing of this band who had this just outsized influence and like just these like regular looking British dudes like who are making these songs. There was always a little bit of a disconnect there, but yeah, it was that's the first time I heard Creep and I loved it. I don't recall owning Pablo Honey though at that time. I'm pretty sure I got that much later in life as I need to complete the collection kind of
Yeah.
purchase. Whereas the Bends, I know I had that on CD before OK Computer came out. And again, I think it was definitely Street Spirit that got me into it, but like I remember like just putting that on in that opening run, Planet Telex, the Bends, well, High and Dry, not so much, but then Fake Plastic Trees, just really falling in love with it then. So I didn't have the same connection, I don't think, to Pablo Honey that you did at that time. But what's funny is I think I probably like it a little bit more than you do today, which is kind of funny how that works out.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's one of those things when you think of a band like Radiohead, where do you go first? And I love the Bends, but if I think of Radiohead today, I'm probably going to OK Computer, Kid A, Amnesiac. Those are the first three. Those are the big
Absolutely.
three for me at my age.
Same here.
And then everything else is an afterthought. And so the other way that I live my life these days is via playlists and song radio on Spotify. And so if I hear something from the Bends, it's probably Fake Plastic Trees coming up because I started playing some other song and it's just on the list and I love it. It's great.
Yeah.
But it's hard to think of this record as, first of all, you and I listen to way too much music. So it's hard to find times to listen to
That is
everything,
true.
even stuff that we love. And then when you do come down to it, the defining record is very rarely going to be the Bends. Although I wrote about it for the site before and we were doing this episode. And so it's been really
Yeah.
fun to go back. And it makes me remember all the B-sides too, because, without being too cool for the room, Maquiladora was one of the B-sides from the Bends. It's absolutely one of my favorite Radiohead songs of all time. You got Killer Cars. You've got so many. This was the introduction of Radiohead for superfans too, because
Yeah.
it was the first time where they had all these different releases, and it's nothing like Nine Inch Nails. But I was conditioned to want to collect everything from a certain band that I liked because of the Halo thing with Nine Inch Nails. And I eventually quit collecting all the different Nine Inch Nails Halos. But in that moment in time, especially in 95, I was deep in it. And I'm like, I need everything by Radiohead because I love it. And oh, there's two songs that I've never heard on this extended single. I need to buy that for $6.99 or $8.99 or whatever it is so that I can hear Maquiladora and Killer Cars. And not every band was able to pull that off. Obviously, nobody pulled it off better than Smashing Pumpkins and maybe Nine Inch Nails. But Radiohead became that kind of a band with the B-sides during this time period.
Yeah, I'm trying to think, like, I don't know that they haven't put out like a collections of their B-sides, but they did like the re-released like double disc version, certainly of OK Computer and
Kid A.
Kid A. I know they did that Kid A / Amnesiac.
Kid Amnesiac, right?
Kid Amnesiac thing. And those had a lot of the outtakes and demos and B-sides from those eras, but I don't remember if they did one for the Bends or not. Do you
They did.
remember?
I don't believe so because, first of all, I looked and I didn't see one. I think you have to go to the Planet Telex and the High and Dry singles in
Yeah,
order
get
to
the
get
actual
those other
singles.
things.
Yeah.
And then they, because they had so many great leftover songs from the OK Computer sessions that they did the Airbag. How is my driving? Was that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
which included Polyethylene and some of those other songs? But I love, that's one of the things that I love about Radiohead. And again, it all started with the Bends. By the way, another reason why I'm guessing you didn't jump in on the Bends, and this is something you and I have talked about a lot about, is in those days you could not buy everything. You had to pick and choose. Do
Right.
you know what other records came out in the same week as the Bends?
Oh, this is good. I'm not going to know off the top of my head. No.
All right. Well, first of all, Collective Soul by Collective Soul.
Okay. Yep, that was a big one for me.
Which one? So which one is that? Which songs are on that
That's
one?
December, Gel, The World I Know. Like
The big one.
that's the big one. Yep.
So that was the one after Shine, which was
Correct.
I can
Hints,
picture the cover.
hints, allegations, and things left unsaid,
Okay.
which is
What a
really.
magical run by Collective Soul, by the way.
And by the way, that album is remarkable because it's literally a demo tape.
Yes.
It's not a real album. Like, it's not a it's an Ed Roland demo tape that got put out under the name because he was just forming the band like in real time. And they had pretty much just decided, like, hey, this song Shine is really good. We need to get this out. And so they just put out a collection of a bunch of demos that he had. And it is surprisingly good for that. Like, it should not be as good as it is considering
Yeah.
that it's demos. And again,
So am I right in saying you probably bought that Collective Soul record the
yeah,
week that it came out?
without a doubt. Yes.
All right. And if not for that one, you might have been purchasing A Boy Named Goo by Goo Goo Dolls.
So that one was definitely a Columbia House purchase. And it was right when it came out. Because if you remember with Columbia House, you would get new releases, but they were always like a month behind. So I was probably about a month behind on that one.
Well, and that one had so many singles on the radio. I feel like maybe I bought that one after the fact at a used record store
Okay.
because I had enough access to it on top 40 alternative rock radio or whatever.
Yeah. What were all the singles on that one? Name.
Yeah. I have to look it up.
I'm forgetting that there was one that was absolutely massive that I'm forgetting the name of. I know I can hear the song in my head, but I'm.
A Long Way Down, Naked.
Oh yeah, Naked.
Johnny Resnick was on fire. A Long Way Down, Burning Up, Naked, Flat Top, Name.
Flat Top. That's the one I was thinking of. That was a big one for me.
Yeah. What a crazy record.
I need to listen to that again. It has been a minute since I have listened to that album.
We've got our next
There we go.
30th anniversary. I don't think we can devote a whole episode to A Boy Named Goo.
No, not so much. But I will say, I do remember, I don't know if it was the very first song, but when I got in high school, when I got my bass guitar, I subscribed to Guitar World, and I was already a subscriber before I got my bass guitar because there were lots of great features and interviews and stuff. But if you remember, they would always have the 4 songs that they would give you the tabs for.
Yeah.
And one of the issues that I had Goo Goo Dolls' name, the tabs on it. And when I got my bass, like, that's such a simple bass line that I was able to play it. And I would just play that over and over and over and over again, like getting the dexterity in my fingers to play bass. So I have a very fond memory of that one.
Yeah, I forgot about all those guitar magazines. I didn't even play guitar, but I used to buy them anyway, just because
you had to back then. That's how we knew about, like, the internet was not fully formed in a way that all this information was at your fingertips. That's how you learned about these bands, was buying these magazines and waiting for them to do a feature on the artists that you love.
And even if I didn't understand the tabs, there'd be an interview with somebody, and
Yep, every time.
It's just amazing.
Yep.
So what else do we need to talk about when we're talking about the Bends? I mean, I feel like you've mentioned Street Spirit a couple times, but if I'm being honest, I think that song helped shape my forever lasting opinion about how strong albums need to end.
Yeah.
Because ending an album with Street Spirit, I'm not sure that you can take any album ending song from that entire era, and I'm going the entire grunge era, and I don't know that you can do much better than that. You know, for me personally, Kitchenware and Candy Bars, as long as you forget about the hidden track, the Calypso hidden track on Purple by Stone Temple Pilots. I don't think hidden tracks count. So that one's a strong one for me, but certainly not as well regarded as Street Spirit by any means.
I don't know. I'm trying to think if I would definitely say Street Spirit is my favorite song on the album.
I would have to.
It probably is. But what's funny about it is the restraint to write that song and to have that song and to not release it as the first single. It was one of the last singles to come out. You didn't put it early in the album. You had the restraint because you knew, like, the art demanded that that be the album closer. And I respect that so much because, and we've already talked about it, this was a band that had a lot of pressure to deliver hits. And again, this is not an era, as much as you could skip songs on CDs, this was still not an era where you were just like, oh, let me just put on this song and put it on a playlist. You would do some mixtapes and things like that. But for the most part, albums were listened to from front to end. And so many people would just front load their albums with the best 5 or 6 songs would be the first 5 or 6 songs of the album. And then you'd
It's
have
a
all this.
brave choice to put that at the end.
It really is. And I just respect them so much for just understanding that. Like I said, the art form demanded that that be the album closer. And it's in every way, to me, that's a perfect song. It's an absolutely perfect song.
Well, and one other thing, and I think I've told this story before. I know you and I have talked about it before, but I'm just going to tell it again because it's so great. So Street Spirit was playing in my friend's house, and he is one of the most incredible musicians I've ever known in my entire life. He's a pianist. He can play guitar. He plays drums. He plays all these instruments better than I do, and some of those are my first instruments. The only thing I can sing better than he can. That's it. But so he's got a son who's a senior in high school now, and his son has perfect pitch. He can just hear notes and hear them perfectly. And so Street Spirit comes on and he's listening to it. His son's listening to it, and he goes, that's out of tune. That's out of key. And he goes over to the piano and he starts playing it, and he goes, see, it doesn't match. It's off pitch. And so I had to Google it, and in that recording session, John Leckie used a lot of analog recording still. It wasn't digital. It wasn't all Pro Tools. Mm-hmm. And so they decided in the final mix, when they were listening to it, that it needed to be slowed down a little bit to get the proper vibe. So they just slowed the tape down a little bit. It adjusted the pitch downward. So it's like, it's not even an actual note. It's like kind of between notes. It's like the 13th and a half floor.
Yep.
And anybody with perfect pitch is driven insane by that song. But I think it, who knows whether it would have captured the exact vibe they wanted to capture if it had just been straight.
Some bands have done that on purpose, just slightly detuned like one string just to create like a little bit of tension. Because even though those of us without perfect pitch, can't recognize what it is, it does create that tension. It's just a little bit, it's ever so slightly off to make you feel sort of uneasy about it because it's not landing where it's supposed to. And again, I don't know that they did it on purpose. To your point, it might have just been a product of slowing it down, ever so slightly. But what's funny about that song for me is, so I'm left-handed, but I play guitar right-handed. And the reason for that is simply when I got my bass guitar, it was a hand-me-down, and nobody had left-handed bass guitars. So I just had to learn it. Well, on the bass, I was just like, well, this is no big deal. My left hand is way more coordinated than my right hand anyway. So this is actually great. It was really easy for me to already finger the frets, and, I had pretty good dexterity with my left hand. But when I got a guitar, then I bought a right-handed guitar because I was already used to playing bass that way, and it didn't make sense in my brain to try to figure out how I would do it the opposite way. And again, I'm like, why would anybody do that anyways? Like, when you play the chords, my hand is so much more coordinated. My left hand is so much more coordinated for fingering these chords. Like, why would anybody do this? And the song that I tried to learn the first time that made me realize why that's wrong was Street Spirit, because of the coordination you need in your right hand to do all the string skipping, the alternate picking of that. It took me so long to be able to figure out how to do that with my right hand. It was so uncoordinated to be able to have control over my alternate picking with that way. And I'm like, I get it. Like, it was only like later that I realized how important that, your right hand is in the sound, and how you strum and how you pick. And, I've adapted. I still play right-handed because I've done
Yeah.
it my whole life, and I've adapted to it. Not that I'm a good guitar player anyways, but the point being, it was just kind of funny to it was Street Spirit that made me first realize, like, oh my God, like my right hand sucks. And like, this is really hard when you feel like you can't control your right hand very well.
Yeah, it's, well, my first instrument starting out as a sixth grader was drums. And then I learned to play the drum kit. And your right hand, as a right hander, is the hi hat. You're most active keeping the time and everything with the right hand. And so for me, that was always my keep the rhythm hand. And so for strumming, it always made sense anyway. But it's
Yeah,
interesting that you felt like your left hand was better on the keyboard, or not the
on the
fretboard,
fretboard. Yeah,
because as a drummer, it was always the rhythm keeper, and
right.
and I'm
Yeah.
really bad at picking anyway. I'm a hack drummer, strummer type guitar player anyway,
Hey, so is Dave Grohl. You just do the Dave Grohl thing and play guitar like it's the drums.
which is hysterical too, by the way, because I still think of that guy as the hacky guitar player. But it turns out, you play guitar for 25 years, you get better.
He's really good. Like,
He's like really good now.
he sells himself short. He's a very good guitar player, but it was eye-opening the first time I heard him talk about that, how he just picked up a guitar, didn't really know how to play. He's like, I just play it like the drums. He's like, I just try to take a drum part and I put it on my guitar. And he showed how he does it. And it makes total sense. And you can never totally unhear it in the way he plays, that everything is so rhythmic in the way he plays. But I mean, it all makes sense.
Well, all you have to do is listen to Everlong. All the syncopated rhythms on Everlong. Most guitar players who are pure guitar players struggle with that one at first until they have to really work on those rhythms. All right, so now that we've done it, and now that you've spent some time listening to the record, how happy are you that we went back and brought this one back to the top of
Yeah, no,
our listening?
I was happy because I was thinking about this when you talked about like what your go-to Radiohead is today, and I'm the exact same way. I primarily listen to Kid A and Amnesiac today, and then if I want to extend outside of that, it's OK Computer. I don't know the last time I listened to Hail to the Thief or In Rainbows, like beginning to end. It's been a very long time.
I actually listened to In Rainbows a couple months ago when I kind of trashed it by accident on this
Okay.
podcast
Okay.
because I had forgotten. I was just wrong. And I
Yeah.
went back and I listened to it and I was like, oh, yeah, no, this one isn't bad.
Yeah, no, it's a good album. It's just a
It's a great
different
album.
Radiohead. It's a
Yeah.
very different Radiohead. And I think we had probably talked about that, how like an entire generation of Radiohead fans, like In Rainbows is the most important album. And it's just so funny for us, that we don't perceive it that way. And so it was
I
fun
think
for
we
me to
need
go
to get
back.
some of the younger millennials on here to talk about their Radiohead experience.
We really do. We really do. But no, so like the Benz is one that I still deeply love. And so I'm always happy to listen to it. It's just not the one I reach for. When I'm in a Radiohead mood today, it's just not very often that this is the one I reach for. But it was a hugely important album in my life, and it's an album I've always loved and have a lot of respect for. And like, it's just tricky because again, we know what Radiohead became. We have those things that came after it to listen to. Like, none of those things probably would have happened if the Benz doesn't happen. So it's like maybe like their most important album. Like, because if they didn't make the Benz, if they just faltered coming out of Pablo Honey, I can't remember if you said it in this intro or the intro we had to scrap for technical difficulties, but they easily could have faltered coming out of that and just disappeared and vanished and been this band that none of us really remember. Like, oh yeah, I remember that. Like, what are some of your favorite one-hit wonders? It's like, oh yeah, that Radiohead song "Creep," like that was a good one. Like that really could have been them if they
It would have
hadn't
been
executed.
Radiohead, Dishwalla, and Harvey Danger.
Space Hog. Space Hog.
Space Hog.
Can't forget about Space Hog.
All right, here's my parting shot. I loved going back and listening to the Bends, but what it really did for me was it caused me to also go back and listen to Maquiladora again. Killer Cars. Go find a YouTube video of Tom York playing Killer Car's solo acoustic. It's a completely different song. It's absolutely incredible. You're going to wish that they'd done a proper studio version that was slower like that. It's just brilliant, brilliant songwriting that only really came out when he was playing those weird promotional acoustic sets that ended up becoming MP3s all over the internet in that era.
Yeah.
But we want to thank you for checking out the episode, joining us as always, all the people on YouTube, listening on Spotify and podcast apps everywhere. This thing has grown tremendously over the last year, and we hope it keeps going. So thanks so much for joining us. You got anything else, Andrew?
No, I think I think we did it.
We done did it. All right.
Yep.
Until next time, thanks so much for listening to the Album of Record podcast.